The land was bone-dry and cracked where the sun hit hardest, a vast expanse of tawny grass and dirt that shifted under wind like slow water. The Wyoming plains rolled on for miles without a break, save for the sharp blue of distant hills and a single line of barbed fence that had lost the war against rust and time. In July, everything whispered of drought. Fence posts leaned like old men, cattle moved only at dusk, and the cottonwood stood still as if bracing for bad news. Elias Vane moved like someone half made of the earth he walked, deliberate, worn, shaped by silence. His boots left shallow impressions in the dust, and his breath steamed faintly in the cool of morning as he approached the western edge of the property. There, a section of fence had given up its hold during the last storm, one post leaning like it had wept its way to the ground. He said nothing as he knelt beside it, the worn creak of leather the only sound. With thick hands, he began the quiet labor of setting things right, measuring, bracing, tamping the post-hole soil with a slow rhythm, like a man driving back ghosts. Elias hadn't spoken much since Margaret died, and when he did, it was more out of necessity than desire. The house they'd shared still stood up on the rise, a plain structure weathered gray by wind and loss. Her rocking chair still faced the western sky, unmoved on the porch. He hadn't touched it. A man didn't move what wasn't his anymore. Just as he reached for the spool of wire, the wind changed. It came low and dust-heavy, and with it, a sound that didn't belong, a faint shuffling, the clop of hooves too light for a ranch horse. He straightened slowly, squinting into the heat shimmer. Across the plain came a rider, though rider seemed too grand a word. The figure slumped slightly in the saddle, arms loose as if every step of the horse asked more than the person could give. The animal itself looked half-starved, ribs drawing maps of famine beneath its hide, and on its back, a woman, a small silhouette against the dawn, head wrapped in a sun-faded kerchief, shoulders cloaked in the dust of long travel. She didn't wave, she didn't call out. Elias watched in stillness, one hand resting lightly on the wire hook at his belt. The woman guided the horse toward the fence, stopped just short of the boundary line. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then she spoke, not loud, but clear enough to carry. Water? That was all. No name, no story. Just a request shaped like a question, folded with quiet like a letter held too long in a pocket. Elias gave a slow nod, gestured toward the windmill pump near the barn. She dismounted without complaint, knees trembling a little as she did. Dust spilled from her skirt like dry river silt. She led the horse to the trough, worked the pump handle herself. The water came slow and stubborn, but clean. She drank first, cupping her hands like a child, then let the horse drink. Elias returned to his fence work, pretending not to watch. But he did, through the corner of his eye, through a silence that thickened with each passing minute. The woman didn't speak again. She didn't ask where she was or if she could stay. She just waited. When the sun had risen higher, burning gold across the hills, Elias set down the hammer. He looked toward the barn and gave a small tilt of his head, barely a gesture. She followed, leading her horse, stepping carefully, as if afraid to stir something deeper than dust. He showed her the empty stall, pointed to the loft above where hay was dry and clean. Still not a word passed between them. She unsaddled the horse herself, checked its hooves, ran her hand gently along its neck. A woman who'd known animals before, that much was clear. Later that evening, after the chores had ended and the sky had bloomed into deep indigo, Elias sat on the porch. The chair beside his, the one that had belonged to Margaret, remained untouched. A small fire burned in the yard's iron ring, more for ritual than warmth. He cradled a tin cup of coffee in his hands, steam curling into the dry air. The woman emerged from the barn just as night settled in. She stood at a distance, framed in shadow, her face unreadable. For a long time, neither said a thing. Then, quietly, he gestured to the porch step. Not the chair, never the chair, but the wooden step where a body could sit and feel the ground close beneath them. She accepted, settling into place with careful movements. From his coat, Elias pulled a second tin cup and handed it to her without looking. She took it. They sat that way for what felt like hours, saying nothing. Only the wind spoke, brushing the grass, shifting the ashes in the fire, humming through the wires of the mended fence. The land remembered. It always did. And now it had one more memory to hold, a grieving man, a woman with nothing but dust and a thirst, and the slow, wordless unfolding of something not yet known, only felt. The days slipped past like dusk over the hills, slow, deliberate, and half-forgotten before they'd even ended. The woman never gave her name, not right away. Elias never asked. Names held weight out here, and weight had a way of sinking people faster than silence ever could. She moved about the ranch like someone waiting for permission to be real, rising early, braiding her hair with frayed twine, working beside him in quiet partnership. She never complained. Not when the water pump jammed, not when a cow miscarried in the frost-slick pasture, not when her fingers cracked open from the cold. She slept in the loft above the barn, where the smell of hay and old wood filled the dark. At night, Elias would hear the soft shift of her body overhead, as though she moved even in her sleep, restless or searching. He never asked what for. By the second week, she had found her own rhythm, feeding the chickens, collecting eggs in the crook of her skirt, sewing up the worn seams of old saddle straps. Elias had repaired fences alone for 3 years, but now he found tools placed neatly where he needed them, wire coils unknotted before he reached for them. Still, they barely spoke. It was during a breakfast of beans and skillet bread, eaten without ceremony under the porch awning, that she finally offered it. "June," she said, barely above a whisper. No prelude, no eye contact. Elias didn't look up, just reached for the salt. All right, that was all. She never told him more. Not about the man who'd carved her name into skin, nor the town that watched her leave with faces turned like sunflowers to shame. But Elias knew something of leaving things behind, knew how the body carried scars long after they'd healed. June's eyes sometimes caught on empty spaces, and when she stared too long at the sky, her lips pressed together like they were keeping something caged. In town, word began to curl through the saloon smoke and dry goods aisles like wildfire too slow to name. She was from Cheyenne, someone muttered. Heard she worked the back rooms of that saloon on Front Street. Another said she'd taken up with a banker's boy, ran off when the baby came dead, and shame came louder. Elias said nothing. He didn't go to town more than he needed just for salt, flour, and nails. When folks prodded, he gave no answer. He let silence speak for him, let the quiet behind his eyes do the talking. A man who's lost too much doesn't barter in gossip. Back on the ranch, June kept moving. She fixed the hinges on the smokehouse door, stitched new covers for the winter bedrolls, and once spent a whole day cleaning the tool shed until every rust-bitten blade shone like bone. Elias noticed, not with words, but with his stillness, how he left fresh coffee on the stoop near her bedroll, how he carved another spoon and left it in the wash basin, rough-hewn and imperfect. One evening, as shadows stretched long and deer moved through the far edges of the pasture, Elias stood watching the windmill creak lazily in the breeze. June approached from the barn, carrying a small basket lined with cloth. Inside were biscuits, still warm, their scent carried on the breeze like a memory. He looked at them, then at her. "I burned the first batch," she said, lips twitching in what might have been a smile. He took one, nodded, sat down on the porch and passed her the seat beside him, not Margaret's chair, but a stump he'd placed there earlier, without thought. They ate slowly, wordless. The moon rose behind them, yellow and full like an old scar. Somewhere in the fields, an owl called once and went quiet. That night, Elias dreamed of Margaret, not her face. He hadn't seen it clearly in years, but of her presence, her silence, her absence. In the dream, she was kneeling by a creek, pouring water from one hand to the other. When he tried to speak, she just shook her head and smiled, and behind her, wildflowers bloomed along the bank, bright and out of season. The next morning, June was already outside when he came down. She had rolled up her sleeves and was scrubbing the porch floorboards with a wire brush. She didn't ask if it needed doing. Elias stood for a long moment in the doorway, watching the curve of her back, the way her hair, unbound, caught the sun like threads of tarnished copper. There was something in the way she moved, careful, like a guest in a house that wasn't sure it had room. But there was defiance too, subtle as a heartbeat. She was cleaning not just the wood, but the story layered over it. Later that day, he walked to the edge of the property where the wild sage grew, tore out the broken fence post that had leaned too long, and put in a new one, by hand. No tools, just a man, his silence, and something close to hope. By early October, the days shortened, the sky hardened, and the wind began to speak in sharper tongues. The sun bled paler on the hills, as if the season itself were pulling its color inward, preparing to fold itself into sleep. The ranch settled into its winter rhythm. Fewer visitors, less noise. The silence thickened, not oppressive, just present, like the stillness in a church after a funeral. Elias welcomed it. So did June, though she never said so. They moved like two gears that had found their mutual pattern. Worn, imperfect, but dependable. Then one morning, the pattern broke. June had gone out alone to check the lower pasture where the fencing dipped into a shallow ravine. Elias found her an hour later, kneeling in the brittle grass, her hands cupped around something small and trembling. A magpie, black and white, wild-eyed, wings crooked, caught in the lowest strand of barbed wire, feathers torn, blood drying at the base of its wing. It looked half dead, its breath shallow as thread. Elias stood above her, the wind kicking dust into his cuffs. She didn't look up. "I found it like this," she murmured, voice barely audible over the breeze. "Don't think it'll last long." He crouched beside her. The bird's eye glinted dark and defiant. Its legs twitched weakly. Elias saw something else in that moment, not a bird, but a shape, fragile and furious, refusing to die without witness. She wrapped it in the hem of her shawl, carried it back like a relic. They cleared a space on the kitchen table, lined an old box with horsehair and scraps of cloth. She fed it droplets of water from a thimble. At night, she slept on the floor beside the hearth with the bird nearby, twitching in sleep. Elias said nothing. But each morning the fire was already lit when he came downstairs. The coals never died through the night. The bird lingered longer than they expected. Its wing healed slowly, jaggedly. It never cried out, but flapped against its makeshift cage when the wind howled through the eaves. June would whisper to it sometimes, words too quiet for Elias to catch, not sweet things, just low rhythms, steady and grave, like prayers spoken in a language only broken things understood. One night the fire crackled lower than usual. June sat cross-legged on the floor, the bird resting beside her, its breath slow. Elias, in his chair, carved another figure from pine, a habit he'd taken up without thinking. Small animals, mostly. He'd leave them on the windowsill or fence posts, letting the weather take them in time. "You lost someone?" June asked, not looking up. It was the first time she'd asked anything personal. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked toward the door, where the wind moaned softly through the cracks. "Margaret," he said finally. "My wife." June nodded, not like someone surprised, but someone who understood that grief rarely needed a stage. "I thought I was going to die," she said, still not meeting his gaze. "Once, long time ago. But I didn't, just kept living like I wasn't supposed to." He didn't ask when or how, just let her words settle. They stayed like that for a long while, two figures in the firelight, shadows cast long on wooden walls, the bird between them. The first snow came quietly one dawn, drifting like ash across the plain. June stood in the doorway, arms folded, watching the land pale. The ranch looked different under snow, cleaner somehow, as if the past had briefly forgotten it. That afternoon, the magpie tried to fly. It stumbled from its box, flapped once, twice, and landed lopsided on the floorboards. June knelt, scooped it up gently, and carried it outside. Elias followed, keeping his distance. She opened her hands. The bird did not leave. Instead, it hopped forward, fluttered, rose a few feet into the air, then sank back down. Not broken anymore, just learning again. "That's enough for today," she whispered, turning back inside. Elias watched her disappear into the house, the shawl loose around her shoulders. He remained in the snow a little longer. Then, without really knowing why, he walked out to the woodshed and began carving again. This time, he shaped a bird, slightly off-kilter, wing lifted as if caught mid-flight. He didn't sign it, didn't show it to her, just placed it on the windowsill by the kitchen, where the magpie often perched now, tapping the glass with its beak when hungry or impatient. The days grew colder, and with them came an illness. It started with a shiver. June said nothing at first, wrapping herself tighter, drinking more broth, sleeping longer. But Elias noticed the tremble in her hands, the flush in her cheeks. One morning she didn't rise from her blankets by the hearth. Elias stoked the fire higher, placed damp cloths across her forehead, left bowls of broth untouched beside her. He didn't know herbs or cures, only presence. So he stayed. He read aloud from a book of Psalms, not for faith, but rhythm. Sometimes she stirred, sometimes she murmured names he didn't recognize. On the third night, the fever broke. She opened her eyes to the dark and saw him dozing nearby, chin slumped to chest, hand still resting on her wrist. She said nothing, just watched him breathe, steady and slow, like the ticking of a clock she'd almost forgotten. By morning, color returned to her face. She stood by the porch later that day, pale but upright, and found something carved in the snow-dusted beam overhead, a small bird, wings stretched toward the eastern sky. By late March, the thaw came in fits, ice clinging to the north faces of trees, while the sun coaxed the meadows into a nervous green. The land held its breath, caught between frost and bloom. Calves were born too early, too small, and lambs cried at night like children lost in fog. The mud was ankle-deep, and the wind carried the scent of things stirring beneath the thaw. Rot, seed, memory. On the ranch, silence remained the firmest foundation. Elias and June moved as always, apart but near. She no longer slept in the barn, but in the old pantry room at the back of the house. It had one small window that faced the cottonwoods. Elias had repaired the sill and placed the carved bird inside it, watching how the evening light fell across its bent wing. They still spoke little, but words now came occasionally, simple things. "Fence needs mending south of the creek. I left stew on the stove. There's a fox den near the coop." Not affection, not declarations, just the careful naming of needs, of facts, of things worth preserving. One morning, a rider came down the path, dusty, stiff, a preacher of some small circuit that crossed these hills 4 times a year. His name was Reverend Polk, or something close to it. Elias greeted him with the caution of a man not used to visitors. June stayed back, watching through the screen door. Polk was tall, thin as hunger, with a voice like dry kindling. He asked if he might hold a gathering next Sunday, just prayer and a few hymns. Elias shrugged. "Folks come," he said. "Let 'em." So they came. 10 or 12 in all, neighbors from 5 miles out, ranch hands, 2 women who kept to themselves. They gathered in the pasture beneath the cottonwoods, where the ground was firm and the wind slow. Polk stood beneath a bare-limbed tree and opened his Bible with theatrical reverence. His voice, light at first, rose with the rhythm of practiced damnation. Sin, and the woman which was a sinner stood at his feet, behind him, weeping. His eyes found June in the crowd, paused, then sharpened. For her sins, which are many, are forgiven. The silence that followed was not holy. It was something else, something brittle. June's face remained still, but Elias saw the way her jaw shifted, the way her eyes did not blink. She stood beside the others with her hands folded, spine straight. The magpie perched on the fence nearby, chittering softly as if uneasy. After the prayers, no one lingered. The preacher offered June a dry nod before riding off into the west. No words exchanged. None needed. That evening the sky turned a dull iron. Rain came slowly, then hard, pounding the roof like fists. June sat at the kitchen table, elbows resting on the wood. Elias lit the fire, its light stretching long shadows across the room. She held a folded letter in her hand. It bore no address now, burned away at the corners, dirt-streaked. He said nothing as she stared at it, unfolding and refolding like a habit. Then, softly, "He was mine, the baby." The fire cracked. Elias kept his eyes on the flames, didn't cry, just came into the world and left it, like he knew better. Her voice had no tremor, only gravity. She let the words land like stones in a dry well. "I waited 3 days after," she went on, "before burying him. Folks in Cheyenne said I was cursed, that I'd done things to deserve it, said no decent woman would have kept him." The rain thickened outside, drumming on the tin roof with reckless rhythm. Elias rose, left the room. When he returned, he carried a bundle, small, wrapped in worn muslin. He set it beside her. She unwrapped it. A carving, a baby no longer than her hand, shaped from driftwood, its face smoothed blank by gentle sanding, arms folded. She blinked slowly. "No one's ever given me something for him," she whispered. Elias sat beside her. He didn't touch her, just sat. The distance between them no longer cold, just quiet. Later, she stood on the porch as the rain softened. The land smelled alive again, wet sage, turned soil, the first breath of spring. She held the carving close, her fingers tracing the rounded head, the curled hands. The magpie flitted up to the porch railing, watching her with one eye, feathers streaked with water. When the clouds finally broke, stars emerged behind them, scattered and unsure. A new kind of quiet settled across the ranch, one born not of sorrow, but of something simpler, endurance. June turned back toward the door. Elias had left the lamp burning. Its light caught on the wooden bird in the windowsill. Two shapes, winged, watching, waiting. She stepped inside without a word. He stood there, not surprised, just present. She looked at him a long time, then quietly, "You don't owe no one." He held her gaze. And in the space between them something shifted, small as the hush before rainfall, deep as the prairie's first thaw. The spring came slow, as if the land had forgotten how. Rain returned in fits, soft and unsure, washing the dust from the cottonwood bark and softening the cracks in the earth. Grass came timidly, then wildflowers, at first just one or two trembling in the lee of the barn, then whole swaths of yellow and violet stretching across the low pasture like forgotten songs. It was June who planted them, not deliberately, not with rows or plans. She simply scattered seed in the soft earth, near fence posts, along the stream bed where the ground had once been barren and unyielding. Elias watched her from a distance. She never knelt as if praying, just bent with quiet purpose, her fingers pressing life into soil that had known only hooves and hardship. He never said it, but he knew. She was planting memory, not hers, not his, just memory. The kind that didn't need names, only bloom. They fell into a rhythm shaped not by habit now, but by choice. He began to cough more, at first with embarrassment, then with resignation. In the mornings, his handkerchief came back red-stained. June saw it once, said nothing. Just added honey to the tea, lined his jacket with wool, and rubbed camphor into the fabric of his shirts. Elias didn't fight it. There are some things men can't mend with hammers and grit. One morning, when the dew still held to the grass and the sky glowed soft as bruised fruit, Elias walked to the barn with June at his side. He carried a plank of driftwood, sanded smooth. In his hand, a carving knife, the blade dulled from use. They stood beneath the eaves. He set the wood across the frame above the barn door and began to carve. Not quickly, not ceremoniously, just steady. June watched, arms folded. He didn't explain. She didn't ask. By mid-morning, it was done. June, that was all. Her name, cut into the wood like a mark made by weather. She traced it once with her fingers, then turned to him and smiled, not wide, not soft, but real, like a horizon clearing. Elias didn't stay long that spring. His body gave no warning, just slowed. One morning, the fire in the hearth had burned down to ash, and the blankets on the bed didn't stir. June stood in the doorway for a long time, her hands resting on the frame, her breath slow and measured. She didn't cry, not then. Grief had been part of her for so long it didn't need performance. She sat beside him, one hand resting on his, and waited until the sky turned gold behind the hills. The ranch didn't change much after that. She kept it going, not because she had to, but because it was alive. She learned to cut fence wire, to bargain for hay, to mend shoes. The magpie stayed for a while longer, then vanished one morning into the sky. She didn't look for it. Some things leave when they're ready. The wooden bird remained in the windowsill. One day, a rider came up the trail, a young man from over the ridge, looking to trade a calf. He found her by the barn, sleeves rolled, dirt on her palms. He paused beneath the sign, reading the name carved above the door. "You June?" he asked, cautious. She nodded. "Folks say you used to be someone else." She smiled. The kind of smile that's tired of defending itself. "We all did," she said. "Till we weren't?" He nodded, offered a handshake. She took it. That night, after supper, she sat on the porch in the old rocking chair, the one that had belonged to Margaret. The air was warm, the kind that carried the smell of sage and river reed. Frogs croaked in the far ditch. The field shimmered with the last light of day. A breeze caught the petals of the wildflowers growing by the path and scattered them like notes from a forgotten melody. They moved gently, slowly, no longer wild, just home. June looked toward the hills. Behind her, inside the house, everything was quiet. No clock ticked, no fire cracked, but the silence was not empty. It was full of what had been given, what had been carried, and what still remained. When someone once asked her, years later, over coffee and dust, who Elias had been to her, she didn't tell them the whole story. She didn't mention Margaret, or the bird, or the preacher who called her Jezebel. She simply said, "He was my greatest honor,